You don't even remember him, do you? The woman hissed as she knelt in front of the little girl, her hands trembling not from rage but grief too long caged. 12-year-old Mara flinched, her fingers curling tighter around the photo frame. She'd carried from room to room since sunrise. It was chipped, cracked at the corner, but her father's eyes in the picture still looked exactly the same. Warm, strong, and unshakably kind. I do remember him, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I just don't know how to say it. The courtroom was too quiet for a Thursday. Not the usual tension of legal proceedings, but a hush, like the walls were holding their breath. At the front, Sergeant Callan adjusted his uniform with the precision of a man who needed distractions. The decorated flag on the stand beside him was for Mara's father, Officer Dax Renly, fallen in the line of duty, shot during an illegal raid 2 years ago. But this ceremony wasn't about medals or folded flags anymore. It was about the strange dog that had been found weeks ago outside the woods near the outskirts of Grover Creek. A golden retriever, battered, wounded, one ear nicked, and the pads of his paws torn open, as if he'd run through hell to get here. No one knew where he came from. No tag, no microchip. Only the police officer's badge in his mouth, cracked and blood-stained. Mara had barely slept since hearing the news. The moment they mentioned the badge number, something inside her started clawing toward the surface. That badge had been buried with her father. She knew because she placed it on his chest herself. The judge had opened an inquiry, not because it made legal sense, but because nobody could explain what was going on. And now the town's officials sat in folding chairs inside this solemn courthouse as the dog, silent and still, lay by the wooden steps like a statue carved from grief. I want to speak, Mara said suddenly, standing up. Her aunt tried to pull her back down, shaking her head. No, honey. Let the adults... No. She stepped forward, shoes scuffing the hardwood, hands shaking. Her voice rose, not from volume, but from something deeper. He's the dog from my father's last shift. The one Dad said was too gentle for police work. He called him River. Gasps moved across the room like a quiet wave. The dog lifted his head slightly at the name, but didn't rise. His golden fur had dulled, matted from exposure. But it was in the eyes, those soft amber eyes, that something stirred. He was listening. My dad brought River home the night before the raid, Mara continued, her eyes shimmering now. He told me the dog failed the aggression test, but he didn't care. He said River was made for protecting, not attacking. I remember watching him feed River from his plate that night. He told me, this one doesn't know how to quit love, even if the world begs him to hate. People weren't breathing. Even Sergeant Callan had lowered his clipboard. And then Dad left that morning, alone. She swallowed, tears catching her breath. Except he wasn't. You see, I think River went with him. I think when the bullets started flying and everyone else fell, River didn't run. I think he stayed. And I think he's been trying to come back ever since. The judge stared at her, stunned, as the dog, slowly, painfully, pushed himself up and limped toward her. No one moved, not even Mara. When River reached her, he sat, then lay, then placed his head gently onto her feet, like he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. Mara dropped to her knees, sobbing, not because it hurt, but because for the first time since her father's funeral, she felt something come back, not a ghost, not a voice, but the echo of love that didn't know how to quit. And in that echo, the whole room broke. Judges wept. Officers turned away. Because there, in the middle of it all, was the truth no one could file away or explain. River hadn't saved her father's life, but he'd saved the part of him that still needed to come home. And now, he had. The silence after Mara's words was heavier than any gavel ever dropped. Even the judge, a man known for his rigid formality, didn't speak. He simply watched, as the girl and the broken golden retriever leaned into each other. The kind of quiet reunion that didn't need permission to exist. Sergeant Callan stepped forward, unsure whether to intervene or kneel. He'd been a hardened officer for 23 years, had seen grief, had buried his own, but nothing prepared him for this. Mara stroked River's fur gently, whispering things too soft to hear. Her fingers traced the jagged line of the scar behind his ear, one that hadn't been there when he was last seen. You tried to protect him, she murmured, voice cracking. You stayed, and then you got lost. Behind her, whispers broke out among the crowd. Not the kind of gossip or courtroom chatter that usually brood, but the kind that carries awe and disbelief. People remembered that raid. Everyone remembered how it ended, with Officer Dax Renly found alone, downed near an old barn, 2 suspects dead, 1 missing, and no sign of a backup unit. They called it a tactical failure, a dispatch mix-up, but no one mentioned a dog until now. The judge cleared his throat, but his voice faltered. Miss Renly, Mara, you understand that without official records, this dog can't be— He is, she said without looking up. You know it. You all do. That badge didn't get here by itself. Callan knelt slowly, setting his hands on his knees like he was approaching a live grenade. Kid, I know your dad. I worked beside him for 12 years. He was the best man I've ever known. And if this dog was his, then he deserves more than a cold shelter and a number tag. River blinked up at him, chest still rising and falling, with exhaustion. But there was something else in his gaze now. Recognition. You remember me, don't you, buddy? Callan asked, voice hoarse. I was the loud one who always dropped his coffee. The dog's tail moved, a single wag, and just like that, the room fell apart again. Later that evening, after the crowd had thinned and the judge called a recess for further evaluation, Mara sat in the station's old interview room. River, curled up beside her. Her aunt paced nearby, phone to her ear, arguing with someone about paperwork and liability. But Mara wasn't listening. Her eyes were locked on the framed photo on the wall, Grover Creek's Wall of Honor. There, frozen in time, was her father, smiling in his uniform. Beside him, just barely visible in the lower corner of the shot, was a golden puppy with comically big paws and floppy ears. That was the proof. Not official enough for a legal ruling, maybe, but real enough for Mara. Callan entered quietly with a small box in his hand. He placed it on the table in front of her, then sat across, sighing like the air had been punched out of him. We found this in evidence storage, he said. It was recovered from the barn after the raid, but no one ever matched it to a report. Mara opened the box slowly. Inside was a faded leather collar, torn but intact, with one engraved tag still dangling. River. She reached over, lifted it carefully, and fastened it around the dog's neck. River didn't resist. He simply leaned closer, pressing his head against her chest. That collar, Callan said, was found next to your dad's body, but no one put it together back then. Too much chaos. Mara looked up, her eyes red. Do you think he saw him die? Callan hesitated. I think River didn't. Let him die alone. And for a man like your father, who gave his life for strangers, I think that mattered. The next morning, the town gathered again, not for a hearing this time, but for something far more human. A decision had been made overnight, quietly, without press releases or legal jargon. The judge stepped forward, removed his robe, and looked directly at Mara. Sometimes, he said gently, the law can't catch up to the truth fast enough, so we're going to let the truth stand on its own. Mara stood with River at her side as he continued. This dog is no longer unclaimed. He is, from this day forward, recognized as a retired service companion to Officer Dax Renly and a member of the Renly family. The crowd applauded, not with fanfare, but with the kind of reverence saved for fallen heroes and those who return carrying pieces of them. River didn't bark. He didn't move. But the soft lift of his tail and the slow blink of his eyes said everything. Later that afternoon, as Mara led him back home, her father's old home, River paused at the front door, hesitating. She knelt beside him, lifting his face in her hands. We're both learning how to come back, she whispered. Let's do it together. And for the first time since her father died, Mara walked into the house not as a girl swallowed by grief, but as someone slowly learning how to heal, with the very soul that refused to let her father's memory be forgotten. Walking beside her, River had returned, not just to a house, but to the only person left who still heard her father's voice when everything else was quiet. And in that silence, they started over, together. Mara had always imagined closure would feel like something loud, like courtroom applause or thunder, or maybe even the shouts of joy she used to picture when her father came home from a long shift. But it didn't. It was quiet. It was River's slow, steady breathing as he slept curled beside her that night. It was the way her aunt pulled a blanket over both of them on the couch, silently brushing tears from her cheek before retreating into the hall. It was Callan lingering at the door, keys in hand, as though afraid leaving would shatter the fragile calm that had finally returned to that house. Mara didn't sleep. Not really. Her fingers traced the fur behind River's ears as she replayed her father's last words in her mind. He had always told her to trust her gut, that it would guide her when he wasn't there to. That morning in court, When she saw River on the auction list with no owner, no name, no past, something had screamed inside her, louder than grief, louder than reason. She hadn't just wanted to see the dog. She'd known it was him. She'd felt it. By sunrise, Mara was awake and already moving. She had something to prove now, not to the judge or even her aunt, but to River himself. He had survived, somehow. Through gunfire, through months on the run, through being forgotten, he had held on, for something or someone. She had to give that faith a reason. Her first stop was the old barn. Callan hadn't wanted her going alone, but she insisted. He followed at a distance, parked down the dirt road with binoculars like some overprotective guardian. But Mara knew she had to walk those steps herself. She needed to see what River had seen, needed to feel it. The barn had long since decayed, half its roof gone, vines strangling the wooden slats. The yellow tape was still wrapped around a few poles, weather-worn but clinging. She stepped inside, the air thick with dust and time. River hesitated outside, tail stiff, his body tense. Mara knelt just inside the door. "It's okay, boy. You don't have to go back in." But after a long pause, River stepped in anyway. He moved slowly, almost reverently, as if his paws remembered each creaking floorboard, and then he stopped, right in front of a scorched patch of dirt. A faint stain marked the center, barely visible under the light filtering through the holes in the roof. This was where her father had fallen. River sat and didn't move. Mara dropped to her knees beside him, throat closing. "You stayed here," she whispered, voice shaking. "You waited for someone to come." River's eyes, tired but unflinching, locked onto hers, and no one did. The guilt burned hotter than the morning sun. She had to do something. She couldn't change the past, but she could make sure River was never forgotten again. That night, she and Callan sat across a kitchen table littered with photos, old files, and a small notepad full of names. They were going to find the people responsible. Her father hadn't just been ambushed. He had been lured, trapped, and River had chased them. He'd tried to protect him. The scars weren't just from crossfire. They were deliberate. There had been another dog, someone said. A trained animal used as a distraction. It wasn't just a failed dispatch. It was a setup. Callan leaned back, rubbing his eyes. "You know, this could get ugly, kid. These people, if they're still around." "I'm not scared," she said. River wasn't. Callan smiled faintly. "You really are your father's daughter." They started with the badge number. A few obscure reports from the raid had been flagged by someone named Officer Melton, who had since retired, vanished into the mountains. But one detail stood out in the report. A note about an unlicensed canine spotted near the crime scene. Not River, not registered, another dog, a decoy. Mara knew if she could find that lead, she could clear River's name forever. And maybe, just maybe, understand why he had stayed behind, what he had been trying to protect even after her father had died. She left the table, walking out onto the porch with River close behind. The sky was bruised with stars, the air cool. She sat on the steps, and River placed his head gently in her lap. "You saved him," she whispered. "And I think you tried to save more. You were trying to come back to us." He blinked slowly, eyes finally closing. Safe now, but just before sleep claimed him, he gave a soft whimper, not of pain, of memory. A girl. There had been another girl. Mara's breath caught. He hadn't just stayed for her father. He had stayed for a child. Another child who had been there, and who was still missing. She bolted upright. "Callan," she called, running inside. "There's someone else." He didn't stay alone. He was trying to protect a girl. Callan stared at her, frowning. "Are you sure?" River stood behind her now, alert, tail stiff, eyes burning with something urgent. "I don't know who," Mara said, voice rising. "But he does, and we have to find her." Callan nodded slowly. The story wasn't over. It had just begun again, and this time, they weren't chasing ghosts. They were chasing truth, side by side. They didn't sleep that night. Not Mara, not River, not Callan. The moment Mara remembered the girl, just a glimpse buried in River's memory, in the echo of a whimper, something inside her shifted. She could no longer grieve quietly. She had to act, and Callan, watching, the fire in her eyes, knew better than to stop her. They dug deep into the police files her father left behind. There were 2 reports of children missing from the same area. The first, a runaway who had returned home weeks later. But the second, she had vanished the day after the ambush. A 6-year-old named Riley Kess. Her name was barely a footnote in the documents. No clear witness, no search team, just a closed file marked "Assumed Deceased," like she'd never mattered. Mara clutched the page, jaw clenched. What if she didn't die? What if River stayed behind because she was still there? Callan didn't answer, but he was already dialing. Former officers, locals, old rescue volunteers. He didn't need convincing. River had protected a man in uniform until his last breath. There was no way he'd leave a child behind, not if he could help it. By sunrise, they were on the road. The barn was long gone, but River wasn't leading them there this time. No, he sniffed the air, circled the path, then turned sharply toward a broken tree line. His movements were deliberate, almost desperate. He was following something Mara couldn't see, but she felt it too, like a string pulling them all toward some buried truth. They found what was left of a hidden well, covered by tangled vines, surrounded by rotted fencing, and nearly swallowed by earth. It would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But River went still. His tail dropped, his ears flattened, and then he whined, long and low. Mara rushed forward, peering into the darkness. The air inside was stale, still. The well had caved in at the edges, but at the bottom, glinting in the sunlight, was something unmistakable. A tiny red shoe. Mara stumbled back. Her breath caught in her throat. Callan said nothing. His hand rested on her shoulder, firm, steady, but she could feel his heart racing. They called it in. An excavation crew arrived 2 hours later. The local sheriff, the same man who had once dismissed the ambush as a botched operation, stood in stunned silence as a small body was gently lifted from the debris. Curled in a protective position, arms wrapped around a stuffed elephant, was Riley Kess, but she wasn't alone. Wrapped tightly around her chest was a strip of shredded police vest, her father's vest, and embedded in the dirt beside her was a single dog tag, Rivers. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. Reporters tried to make it a scandal. The public demanded justice. But Mara didn't care about any of that. Not right now. All she wanted was to go home, to sit with River, to hold the truth in her hands and weep, not from sadness, but from understanding. River hadn't been running. He had been watching, waiting, guarding the girl who couldn't be saved. And when he failed, when her body gave, out from the cold and the fear, he buried her as best he could, marked the site, and returned only when he knew he couldn't stay any longer. Mara stood before a small, makeshift memorial days later. A new grave, a new name carved gently into stone. Riley Kess, 6 years loved. River sat beside her, quiet, solemn, his body aged and worn, but proud. You did everything you could, she whispered, fingers brushing the tag now tied around her own wrist. You were the only one who stayed. She felt Callan's hand on her back. He's not just a hero, he's a witness. Mara turned, voice low but clear. Then we tell his story, all of it, every scar, every truth, and that's what they did. Together they opened a small rescue center, but not for just any dogs, for service animals abandoned, betrayed, or left behind by the very systems they once served. They named it Kess Shelter, for Riley, for the forgotten. River lived out his final years not as a soldier, not as a weapon, but as a guardian, of Mara, of memory, of everything her father believed in. The day he passed, Mara held him close and whispered the words her father once said to her. You're safe now, boy. You did good. You can rest. And she swore, as tears soaked his golden fur, that no hero would ever be forgotten again, not while she still had a voice. Because sometimes the bravest souls don't wear uniforms. Sometimes they walk on 4 legs, and they wait, no matter how long, for someone to finally listen. The ceremony hall was hushed, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of held breath, quiet tears, and the weight of something that mattered. Rows of people sat with stiff backs and solemn faces, officers in full uniform, veterans with canes beside their chairs, families clutching framed photographs of those who never came home. At the front stood Mara, a girl barely 17, but with shoulders that carried generations of silence. And at her side, with fur gone almost silver from the years, sat River, scarred, regal, and still watching everything with those mournful amber eyes. She hadn't planned to speak. Not until she saw the way River's ears had perked up at the sound of the honor guard's drums. Not until she watched a small boy in the front row reach for his father's empty medal. That's when Mara rose from her seat, walked to the podium, and let her truth spill out. My father wasn't supposed to die, she began, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. But I think, deep down, he knew he would. Somewhere in the audience a woman sobbed quietly. He wrote letters I wasn't meant to read until I was older. Letters about courage and sacrifice, sure, but also fear, loneliness, and about a dog he called his shadow. A golden retriever who followed him through fire, through storms, and finally, into silence. Mara turned her eyes toward River, who blinked slowly, almost as if he understood every word. You see, when everyone else left, this dog stayed. When the bullets stopped, and the smoke cleared, when no one came looking, River did something I didn't understand back then. He buried the child he couldn't save. He waited by a road for weeks, and when he finally came home, no one noticed that he never stopped looking over his shoulder. There was no sound, but breathing. People said he was broken, damaged, even dangerous. But I saw something different. I saw a memory, a guardian. I saw my father's legacy carried in a dog's heart. Mara paused and reached into her coat pocket. Slowly, she lifted a small object into view, a folded police badge, scorched at the edges. This was found near a child's remains, buried in the woods, she continued. The child wasn't related to my dad. She wasn't part of his mission, but he gave her his vest and his dog. He didn't run. Neither did River. They stayed. That matters. The room broke then. You could hear it. Men who had buried friends let their faces fall into their hands. Mothers gripped their children tighter. Even the chief of police stood, back ramrod straight, but eyes shining. I know he didn't wear a uniform, Mara said, her voice cracking now, but he deserves to be remembered as one of them. She turned toward River, knelt beside him, and tied the badge gently to his collar. The dog didn't move. He only leaned forward and rested his head against her chest, a low, content sigh leaving his tired lungs. The crowd stood in one unified motion. Applause didn't come instantly. It came in waves, first from one corner, then another, until the entire room roared, not for the fallen officer, not for the department, but for the dog who had been forgotten by the system he once served. Later that evening, as the crowd filtered out and the lights dimmed, Callan approached Mara on the empty stage. You know, he said softly, I've seen medals given to people who never did half of what that dog did. Mara nodded, brushing a hand over River's fur. Then it's time we start giving medals to the ones who truly earned them. They didn't go home right away. Instead, they stopped by the graveyard where her father was buried. A new plaque had been placed beneath his name. It read, In honor of River, faithful to the end. Mara knelt down, pressing her forehead to the cool marble. He waited for me, Dad. You don't have to worry anymore. River laid beside her, eyes closed, tail thumping weakly in the dirt. The stars above seemed brighter than usual. Or maybe they always had been. Maybe she just hadn't looked up in a while. The next morning, they woke to news spreading across the nation. Headlines weren't about war or tragedy for once. They were about a golden retriever who stayed behind when no one else did. About a girl who told the story nobody had dared to remember. Donations flooded in for the shelter. Letters from soldiers. Messages from families who'd lost everything, but found comfort in a stranger's courage. River passed away in his sleep 1 week later. He didn't whimper. He didn't cry. He simply curled beside Mara's bed, nose resting on the badge she'd pinned to his collar, and exhaled one final time. Mara didn't scream. She didn't beg for more time. She only whispered the words she had rehearsed in her heart every night for months. You made it home. They buried him beside her father, wrapped in the same vest he had once torn to protect a child. And as the last shovel of earth settled over the grave, Mara placed a medal on top. A real one this time. A hero's medal. Because some heroes don't ask for honor. They just wait long enough for someone brave enough to tell the truth. And this time, someone did.